1 of Our Army at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Our Army at the Front by Heywood Broun. Chapter 1. The Landing of Pershing. A ship warped into an English port. Along her decks were lines of soldiers of high and low degree, all in khaki. From the shore end of her gangplank other lines of soldiers spread out like fan sticks, some in khaki, some in the two blues of land and sea fighters. Decorating the fan sticks were the scarlet and gold of staff officers, the blue and gold of naval officers, the yellow and gold of land officers, and the black of a few distinguished civilians. At the end of one shore line of khaki, one rigid private stood out from the rest, holding for dear life to a massive white goat. The goat was the most celebrated mascot in the British Army, and this was an affair of priceless consequence. But that was no sign the goat intended to behave himself, and the private was responsible. Weaving through this picture of military precision, three little groups of men waited restlessly to get aboard the ship. One was the Lord Mayor of the port city, his gilt chains of office blazing in the forenoon brightness, with his staff. Another was the half-dozen or so of distinguished statesmen, diplomats, and military heroes, bringing formal welcome to England. The third was the war correspondents and reporters from the London newspapers. The waiting was too keen and anxious for talk. The excitement raced from man to man. For the ship was the Baltic. The time was the morning of June 8, 1917. The event was the landing of John J. Pershing, commander of America's Expeditionary Force, and the soldiers with him were the herald of America's coming, the holding of her drive with an outpost. When the grandchildren of those soldiers learn that date in their history lessons, it is safe to assume that all its historical significance will be fairly worked out and articulate. It is equally safe to say that in the moment of its happening, few, if any, of its participants, even the most consequential and far-seeing, had a personal sense of making history. Of all the pies that one may not both eat and have, the foremost is that very taking part in a great occasion. All the fun of it is being got by the man who stays at home and reads the newspapers, undistracted by the press of practical matters in hand. True, for the landing of General Pershing there was the color of soldiery, the blare of brass bands, the ring of great names among the welcomers. There was, of course, the overtone picture of a great chieftain, marching in advance of a great army, come to foreign lands to add their might to what, with their coming, was then a world in arms. The future might see, blended with the gray hulk of the Baltic, the shadowy shape of the Mayflower, coming back, still carrying men bound to the service of world freedom. But what they saw that morning was, after all, a very modern landing from a very modern ship, with sailors hastily tying down a gangplank, and doing it very well, because they had done it just that way so many times before. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers were down to give a military welcome, with their mascot and their crack band. The Lord Mayor, Lieutenant General Pitcairn Campbell, Admiral Stileman, and other men from both arms of England's service were there, not to feel of their feelings, but to make the landing as agreeable and convenient as possible, and to convey to General Pershing, with Anglo-Saxon mannerliness and reticence, their great pleasure at having him come. As soon as there was access to the ship, General Campbell and Admiral Stileman went aboard and introduced themselves to General Pershing. They met also a few of the American staff officers, and returned salutes from the privates who made up the Pershing entourage of 168 men. There were congratulations on the ship's safe arrival, which reminded General Pershing and some of his officers that they wanted, before leaving the ship, to pay their respects to the skipper who had carried them through the danger zone without so much as a sniff at a submarine. This done, the little company of officers walked down the gangplank, talking cheerily of their satisfaction at meeting, of their hard work on the ship, of the weather, and what not, All the while the soldiers on the decks behind them waved hands and handkerchiefs in a general outflow of well-being, and finally set foot in England. One may not go too far in describing the contents of a general's mind without some help from him. But it's a fair guess that if General Pershing is as kin to his kind as he seems to be, the very precise moment of his setting foot in England escaped his notice altogether, and was left free for the historian to embroider how he pleased. For General Pershing was in the act of being led to the salute of a guard of honor by General Campbell, and almost immediately after that precise moment the Welsh Fusiliers' band began the Star-Spangled Banner. And again, it's a good bet that General Pershing and his staff thought not a thing about England and a lot about home. But so the historic moment came, and so it went, and presently the American vanguard was finding its places in the special train to London. Perhaps England knew that a great hour was in the making, for her rolling green hills gave back the warmth of a splendid sun, and her hedgerows and wild blooms braved forth in crystal air. Those of the newcomers who saw England first that afternoon thanked their stars fervently that England and democracy were on the same side. In mid-afternoon the train reached London, and here the Americans were greeted not alone by soldiers and England, but by the English. The secret of their coming, carefully kept, had given the port civilians no chance, but they knew it in London, and the station was crowded to its doors. General Pershing stepped from the train as soon as it stopped. Ambassador Walter Hines Page came over to him, both hands outstretched, and asked leave to introduce another general who had taken an expeditionary force to France, General Sir John French. Other introductions followed, to Lord Derby, General Lord Brooke, and Sir Francis Lloyd, and there was a hearty handshake from a fighter who needed no introduction, Rear Admiral William E. Sims. Inside and outside the station the civilians cheered. None of them needed to have General Pershing pointed out to them. He was unmistakable. No man ever looked more the ordained leader of fighting men. He was tall, broad, and deep-chested, splendidly set up, and to the care with which Providence had fashioned him he had added another soldierly care of his own. He might have been patterned upon the Freudian dream of Julius Caesar, if Julius was in truth the unsoldierly-looking person they made him out to be, whose majesty lay wholly in his own mind's eye. The gallant look of General Pershing fanned the London friendliness to contagious flames of enthusiasm. He and his officers were cheered to their hotel, the soldiers were cheered to their barracks in the Tower of London. At the hotel they found 3 floors turned over to them, arranged for good hard work, with plenty of desk room, and boy and girl scouts for running errands. Squarely in the entrance was a money changer's desk with a patient man in charge who could, and did, name the number of cents to the shilling once every minute for 4 days. A little English lady who visited America complained bitterly just after arrival, "Why didn't they make their dollar just 4 shillings?" thereby summing up the only really valid source of acrimony between England and America. The money changer made the international amity complete. Once installed, General Pershing and his staff fell to and worked, continuing the organization that had been roughly blocked out on the Baltic, and building up the liaison between English and American Army procedure, begun by the help of British and Canadian officers on board, by frequent conferences with England's State, War, and Navy departments. The day after the arrival, General Pershing went to breakfast at Windsor, the first meeting between America's fighter and England's king. Here, too, at last, the momentousness of the matter found voice. King George, having done with the introductory greeting, said earnestly,
"I cannot tell you how much your coming means to me. It has been the great dream of my life that my country and yours would join in some great enterprise. And here you are."
After this visit, prolonged by an inspection of the historic treasures of Windsor Castle, General Pershing made the rule of unbroken work for himself and his officers till his task in London was finished and he should leave for France to join his 1st Division. He made what he expected to be a single exception to this rule. He went to a dinner party, at which he met Lloyd George, Alfred Balfour just back from his American mission, and half a dozen others of commensurate distinction. He found that his exception was no exception at all. The English do not merely have the reputation of doing their real work at their dinner parties, they deserve that reputation. Staff officers, telling all about it later on, said that it could hardly have been distinguished from a cabinet meeting, or a report from the Secretary of State for War. So were the final plans made and the business of the nations settled. Concerning all these meetings and all the national feeling that was behind them, General Pershing and his officers were of one voice, that England's welcome had been precisely of the sort that pleased them most. It was reticent, charming, too genuine for much open expression, too chivalrous at heart to be obtrusive. What with spending most of each 24 hours at work, the American vanguard finished up its affairs in 4 days, and early on the morning of June 13, long before the break of day, General Pershing and his officers and men boarded their Channel boat, the Invicta, and set sail for France. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Our Army at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Our Army at the Front by Haywood Broun. Chapter 2. Vive Pershing. The Invicta came into Boulogne harbor in the early morning to find that her attempts at a secret crossing had amounted to nothing at all. Everybody within sight and earshot was out to show how pleased he was, riotously and openly, indifferent alike to the hopes of spy or censor. The fishing boats, the merchant coastwise fleet, the Channel ships, and hordes of little privately owned sloops and yawls and motorboats all plied chipperly around with banniere étoilée, fore and aft. The sun was very bright, and the water was very blue, and between them was that exhilarating air which always rises over the coasts of France, whenever and wherever you land on them, which not all the smoke and grime of the world's biggest war could deaden or destroy. The Invicta's own flags were run up at the harbor mouth. Again the lines of khaki-colored soldiers formed behind the deck rails, and again the chieftain from overseas stood at the prow of his ship and waited the coming of a historic moment. When the Invicta was made fast and her gangplank went over, there was a half-circle of space cleared in the quay in front of her by a detachment of grizzled French infantrymen, their horizon-blue uniforms filmed over with the yellow dust of a long march. Behind the infantrymen, the good citizens of Boulogne were yelling their throats dry, when General Pershing stopped for an instant's survey at the head of the gangplank, with his staff officers close behind him. The roar of welcome swelled to thunder and resounded out to sea. When he marched down and stepped to the quay, there was a sudden arresting silence. Every soldier was at salute, and every civilian, too. In that tense instant a new world was beginning, and though it was as formless as all beginnings, the unerringly dramatic and sensitive French paid the tribute of silence to its birth. The future was to say that in that instant the world allied on new bases, that men now fought together not because their lands lay neighboring, or were jointly menaced by some central foe, but because they would follow their own ideal to wherever it was in danger. An American general had brought his fighters 3,000 miles because a principle of world order and world right needed the added strength of his arms. And never before had American soldiers come in their uniforms to do battle on the continent of Europe. The moment's silence ended as startlingly as it began. Bands and cheerers set in again on one beat. The officers who had come to make a formal welcome fell back and let the unprepared public uproar have way. General Pershing and his officers walked through aisles strenuously forced by the infantrymen to where carriages awaited to carry them through the Boulogne streets. It must have seemed to the little American contingent as if every Frenchman in France had come up to the coast for the celebration. From the carriages, the crowds stretched solid in every direction. The streets were blanketed under uncountable flags. Every window held its capacity of laughing and cheering Frenchwomen. Children ran along the streets, shrilling "Vive l'Amérique!" and laughing hilariously when their flowers were caught by the grateful but embarrassed American officers. When the special train to Paris had started, the officers mopped their faces and settled back for a modest time. But they reckoned without their French. Not a town along the way missed its chance to greet the Americans. The stations were packed, the cheers were incessant, the roses poured in deluges into the train windows. But at the Gare du Nord, in Paris, the official French greeting was too magnificent to be pushed aside further by mere populace. There were cordons of soldiers drawn up in the station, stiff at attention, making aisles by which the French officials could get to the Americans. There were officers in brilliant uniform, covered with medals for heroic service. There were massed bands, led by the Garde Républicaine. Papa Joffre was there, with his co-commissioner Viviani, Painlevé, then Minister of War, and presently to have a while as Premier, General Foch, Marne hero, now Generalissimo, and Ambassador William G. Sharp. These, with General Pershing, Major Robert Bacon, a member of Pershing's staff and lately ambassador to France, and 2 or 3 other staff officers, found open motor cars waiting to drive them to the Hotel Crillon on the Place de la Concorde, the temporary American headquarters. Dense crowds of soldiers patrolled the streets leading down to the grand boulevards, through which the distinguished little procession was to take its way, and other soldiers lined up at attention in the boulevards. Paris turned loose, with her heart in her mouth and her enthusiasm at red heat, is not easily forgotten. On this June day her raptures were immemorial. They were of a sort to call out the old-timers for standards of comparison. Every sentence now spoken in France begins either "avant la guerre" or "depuis la guerre." Nobody can ignore the fact that with August 1914 the whole of life changed. To the old-timers who wanted to tell you what Paris was like the afternoon Pershing arrived, there were only 2 occasions possible, both depuis la guerre. The first great day was that following the order for general mobilization, when exultation, defiance, threat, and frenzy packed the national spirit to suffocation, and when the streets flowed with unending streams of grim but undaunted people. Tragic days and relief days followed. But the next great time, when tragedy did not outweigh every other feeling, was that 14th of July, 1916, when the military parades were begun again, for the first time since the war, and in the line of march were detachments from the armies of all the Allies. The third great French war festival was for Pershing. The crowds were literally everywhere. The streets through which the motors passed were tightly blocked except for the little road cleared by the soldiers. The streets giving off these were jammed solid. American flags were in every window, on every lamp-post, on every taxicab, and in every wildly waving hand. Although the soldiers could force a way open before the motor cars, no human agency could keep the way free behind them. The Parisians wanted not merely to see Pershing, they wanted to march with him. So they fell in, tramping the boulevards close behind the cars, cheering and singing to their marching step. Only when General Pershing disappeared under the arched doorway of the Hotel Crillon, and let it be known that he had other gear to tend, did the city in procession break apart and go about its several private celebrations. But all that afternoon, and all that night, wherever men and women collected or children were underfoot, it was "Vive l'Amérique" and "Vive le Général Pershing" that echoed when the glasses rose. When General Pershing, after the tremendous experience of his European landing, asked for the quiet and shelter of his own quarters at the Crillon, his intention was that his retirement should be complete. He said flatly that a man who had just witnessed such a tribute to his country as Paris had made that afternoon was no better than he should be if he did not feel the need of solitude. But the inevitable aftermath of the great event the world over is talking with the newspapers. And sure enough, no sooner was General Pershing safe in his retreat than the Paris reporters were knocking at the door. The American correspondents who had traveled over from London on the Invicta had had emphatic instructions to stay away, story or no story. But one distinguished Frenchman broke the rules, and to François de Jesson of Le Temps, General Pershing did finally give a statement, how reluctantly one may see from the statement's contents. I came to Europe to organize the participation of our army in this immense conflict of free nations against the enemies of liberty, and not to deliver fine speeches at banquets, or have them published in the newspapers, said General Pershing. Besides, that is not my business, and you know we Americans, soldiers and civilians, like not only to appear, but to be businesslike. However, since you offer me an opportunity to speak to France, I am glad to make you a short and simple confession. As a man and as a soldier, I am profoundly happy over, indeed proud of, the high mission with which I am charged. But all this is purely personal, and might appear out of proportion with the solemnity of the hour and the gravity of events now occurring. If I have thought it proper to indulge in this confidence, it is because I wish to express my admiration of the French soldier, and at the same time to express my pride in being at the side of the French and Allied armies. It is much more important, I think, to announce that we are the precursors of an army that is firmly resolved to do its part on the continent for the cause the American nation has adopted as its own. We must come conscious of the historic duty to be performed when our flag shows itself upon the battlefields of the world. It is not my role to promise or to prophesy. Let it suffice to tell you that we know what we are doing and what we want. Two memorable experiences waited the next day for General Pershing. The first was his visit to Invalides, the tomb of Napoleon. The second, his appearance in the French Chamber of Deputies. If he had known what it was to be the hero of all Paris at once, he was to learn how special groups regarded him, and what the French highest in command thought fitting for America's leader. At all of General Pershing's appearances in Paris in these first days, a detachment of soldiers had to be constantly before him, widening a way for him through the crowds that waited his coming. On the morning of his visit to the tomb of Napoleon, the broad Champ de Mars, in front of des Invalides, was impassable except by the soldiers' flying wedge. Shouts in French rang out steadily as he made his way toward des Invalides entrances, and suddenly a man cried in accented English, "Behind him there are 10 million more." But once inside des Invalides, General Pershing was alone with General Niox, who was in charge of the famous treasure building, and General Joffre. Between Pershing and Joffre there had begun one of those intense friendships that form too impetuously for ordinary explanation. It was full grown at the end of their first meeting, a matter of seconds, and though at this time their friendly intercourse was halted sometimes by the fact that neither spoke the other's language, they were continually together. So it was General Joffre who walked beside him when General Pershing followed General Niox down to the entrance of the crypt and stood before the door. All the world may go to this door if its behavior is good, but only royal applicants may go beyond it. General Pershing was to go inside. General Niox handed him the great key, then turned away with Joffre, while Pershing, after a moment's hesitation, fitted the key and crossed the threshold. When he came out again, he was taken to see the Napoleonic relics, which lay in rows in their glass cases. Two of them, the great sword and the Grand Cross cordon of the Legion of Honor, had never been touched since the time of Louis Philippe. As Pershing and Joffre bent over them, General Niox came to a momentous decision. He opened the cases and handed the two to General Pershing. France could do no more. Pershing held them for a moment and nobody spoke. Then he handed back the cordon, kissed the sword hilt, and presented it, and in profound silence the three men left the treasure hall. Between this visit and that to the Chamber of Deputies there were many official calls, including one to President Poincaré at the Élysée Palace, which ended in a formal luncheon to Pershing by President and Madame Poincaré, with most of the important men of France as fellow guests. General Pershing was recognized as he entered the gallery of the Chamber of Deputies, and all other business except that of doing him honor was promptly put by. Full-throated cheering began and would not die down. Finally, Premier Ribaut commenced to speak, and the deputies stopped to listen. The people of France fully understand the deep significance of the arrival of General Pershing in France, he said. It is one of the greatest events in history that the people of the United States should come here to struggle, not in the spirit of ambition or conquest, but for the noble ideals of justice and liberty. The arrival of General Pershing is a new message from President Wilson which, if that is possible, surpasses in nobility all those preceding it. And Viviani said a few minutes later, President Wilson holds in his hand all the historic grandeur of America, which he now puts forth in this fraternal union extended to us by the great Republic. These two speeches opened a floodgate. Long after the cheering deputies had said their goodbyes to General Pershing, the French writers, made articulate by the example of Ribaut and Viviani, were busily preparing appreciations and commentaries of the Pershing arrival. The most picturesque of these was Maurice de Waleff's in Le Journal. There are no longer any Pyrenees, said Louis XIV, when he married a Spanish princess. There is no longer an ocean, General Pershing might say, with greater justice, as he is about to mingle with ours the democratic blood of his soldiers. The fusion of Europe and America is an enormous fact to note. A more powerful speech was that of Clemenceau, now Premier of France, but then an earnest private citizen writing for his paper. Paris has given its finest welcome to General Pershing, he wrote. We are justified in hoping that the acclamation of our fellow citizens, with whom are mingled crowds of soldiers home on leave, have shown him clearly, right at the start, in what spirit we are waging the bloodiest of wars, with what invincible determination never to falter in any fiber of our nerves or muscles. Unless I misjudge America, General Pershing, fully conscious of the importance of his mission, has received from the cordial and joyous enthusiasm of the Parisians that kind of fraternal encouragement which is never superfluous, even when one needs it not. Let him have no doubt that he too has brought encouragement to us, the whole of France, that follow with its eyes the whole of his passage along the boulevards, to all our hearts that salute his coming with joy at the supreme grandeur of America's might enrolled under the standard of right. This idea M. Viviani, just back from America, splendidly developed in his eloquent speech to the Chamber of Deputies in the presence of General Pershing. General Pershing himself, less dramatic, has given us in 3 phrases, devoid of artificiality, an impression of exceptionally virile force. It was no rhetoric, but the pure simplicity of the soldier who is here to act, and who fears to promise more than he can perform. No bad sign, this, for those of us who have grown weary of pompous words, when we must pay so dearly for each failure of performance. Not long ago the Germans laughed at the contemptible English army, and we hear now that they regard the American army as too ridiculous for words. Well, the British have taught even Hindenburg himself what virile force can do toward filling gaps in organization. Now the arrival of Pershing brings Hindenburg news that the Americans are setting to work in their turn. Those Americans whose performance in the War of Secession showed them capable of such improvisation of war as the world had never seen. And I think the Kaiser must be beginning to wonder whether he has not trusted rather blindly in his German tribal god. He has loosed the lion from its cage, and now he finds that the lion has teeth and claws to rend him. The Kaiser has given us but a few weeks in which to realize that the success of his submarine campaign would impose the silence of terror on the human conscience throughout the world. Well, painful as he must find it, Pershing's arrival with its consequent military action cannot fail to prove to him that, after all, the moral forces he ignored must always be taken into account in forecasting human probabilities. Those learned Boches have yet to understand that in the course of his intellectual evolution man has achieved the setting of moral right above brute force, that might is taking its stand beside right, to accomplish the greatest revolution in the history of mankind. That is the lesson which Pershing's coming has taught us, and that is why we rejoice. But even while the commentators were at their task, General Pershing had left off celebrating and got to work. The 1st Division was on the seas. A few very important persons in France and America knew where they were to land, and when but nobody in the world knew just what was to be done for and with them once they landed, for the plans did not even exist. It was the business of the general and his staff to create them, and they say that the amount of work done in those first days in France was incredible even to them when they looked back on it. As a first step, American headquarters were installed in 31 Rue Constantine, a broad, shaded street near the Hôtel des Invalides, overlooking the Champ de Mars. The house had belonged once to a prodigiously popular Paris actress, and it was correspondingly magnificent. But the magnificence, except that which was inalienably in space and structure, was banished by the busy Americans. In the hallway they stretched a plank railing, behind which American private soldiers asked and answered questions. Under the once sumptuous stairway there were stacks of army cots. The walls were bulletined and covered with directions carefully done in 2 languages. The chief of the intelligence section had the ex-dining room, and the adjutant general had the ballroom on the 2nd floor. Even so, it was not long before this spaciousness was insufficient, and the headquarters brimmed over into number 27 as well. It was in these 2 houses that the whole army organization was plotted out, and General Pershing made good his prediction that the Americans would not merely seem, but would be, businesslike. After 10 days or so of beaver-like absorption in their jobs, the American headquarters announced to the war correspondents that they must take a certain train at a certain hour under the guidance of Major Frederick Palmer, press officer and censor, to a certain port in France. There, at a certain moment, they would see what they would see. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Our Army at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Our Army at the Front by Heywood Brown. Chapter 3. The 1st Division lands. They saw the gray troopships steaming majestically into the middle distance from the gray of the open sea, with the little convoy fleet alongside. It was a gray morning, and at first the ships were hardly more than nebulous patches of a deeper tone than sea and sky. As they neared the port and took on outline, the watchers increased and took on internationalism. The Americans who had come to see this consequential landing, some in uniform and some civilians, had arrived in the very early morning, before the inhabitants of the little seaport town were up and about, let alone aware of what an event was that day to put them into the history books. But it never takes a French civilian long to discover that something is afoot, what with 3 years of big happenings to sharpen his wits and keep him on the lookout. At the front of the quay were Americans, 2 deep, straining to make out the incoming ships, on tiptoe to count their number, breathless to shout a welcome to the first Old Glory to be let loose to the harbor winds. Forming rapidly behind the Americans were Frenchmen, French women, and French children, indifferent to affairs, kitchens, or schools, chattering that "Mais sûrement que sont les Américains? Regardez, regardez!" Ignominiously in the rear, but watching too, were the German prisoners who worked, in theory at least, at transferring rails from inconvenient places to convenient ones for the loading of coaster steamers. They said little enough, having learned that a respectful hearing was not to be their lot for a while, but they moved fewer rails than ever, and nobody bothered to speed them up. The great ships came in slowly, Before long the watchers could see lines of dull yellow banding the grey hulks, and then the yellow lines took on form and separateness, and were visible one soldier at a time. Last, one ship steamed apart from the others and made direct for the quay, and the solemn business of landing American troops on French soil was about to begin. There was to be a certain ceremony for the landing, but like all the ceremonies conceded to these great occasions by the American army, it was to be of extreme simplicity. When they were near enough to the quay to be heard, the transport band played the Star-Spangled Banner, while all the soldiers stood at salute, and then they played the Marseillaise, while everybody on ship and shore stood at salute. With that, they called it a morning, as far as celebration was concerned, and to the accompaniment of a great deal of talk and a volley of light-hearted questions, they began to disembark. The first question, called from some distance away, was, "What place is this?" The next was, "Do they let the enlisted men drink in the saloons over here?" And there was a miscellany about apple pie and doughnuts, cigarettes, etc. And very briefly, after the first soldiers were ashore, nothing could be heard but, "Don't they speak any English at all?" The outstanding impression of that morning may be what it will to the French civilians, to the American newspaper correspondents, and to the officers both ashore and on board. To the privates of the 1st Division it will always be the incomprehensible nonsense that goes by the name of the French language, spoken with perfect assurance by people old enough to know better, who refuse to make one syllable of intelligible sound in answer to even the simplest requests. The privates were prepared to hear the French speak their own language at mention of Alsace-Lorraine and war aims, or to propound their private philosophies that way. They granted the right of the French to talk how they pleased of their emotional pleasure at seeing the troops, or of any other subject above the timber line. What staggered them was the insane top loftiness of using French to ask for ham and eggs and beer, or the way to camp. For nothing, not volumes of warning before they left home, nor interminable hours of French grammar instruction on board the troop ships, had really got it deep inside the American private's head that French was not an accomplishment to be used as evidence of cosmopolitan culture, but a mere prosy necessity, without which daily existence was a nightmare and a frustration. The French on their side were helpless enough, but not so bewildered. They had lived too long in peace as well as war, across a narrow channel from that staunch English-speaking race who brought both their tea and their language with them to France and everywhere else, to be dumbfounded that strangers should balk at their foreign tongue. The inevitable result was that here, in their first contact with the French, as later, throughout the fighting areas, the American soldiers learned to understand French English long before they could speak a decent word of French. Fortunately for the 1st Division, it had had some able bilingual forerunners at the seaport town where they landed. The camps had been built by the French a few miles back from the town, but a few of the housekeeping necessities had been installed by General Pershing's staff officers, and signs in good, plain English showed the proper roads. And as the single files of soldiers began to descend the gangplank of the first transport and to form for marching to camp, their own officers were having some compact instruction from the staff officers on how to get to camp and what to do when they got there. There was no waste motion about getting the troops under way. The first companies were tramping up the streets before the last companies were overside, and the first transport was free to go back and give place to the next one before the mayor had got his red sash and gilt chains in place and arrived to do them suitable honor. So while the shore watchers fell back into safe observation posts, the soldiers clattered down through the quay sheds to the little street, formed and swung away, and one ship after another disgorged its passengers, and presently the sheds were overrun with the blue-clad sailors from the convoys. All that day the soldiers marched through the town, Their camps lay at the end of a long white shore road, and jobs were not wanting when they got there. Their pace was easy because of these things, and they probably would not have put out any French eye with their flawless marching, even under less indulgent circumstances. For this 1st Division was recruited in a hurry, and most of their real training lay ahead of them. Where they were impressive was in their composite build. There were little fellows among them, but they straggled at the back. The major part of the soldiers were tall, thin, rangy-looking, with a march that was more lope than anything else, and a look of heaving their packs along without much effort. They fell about midway between the thin, breedy look of the first English troops in France and the stocky, thick-necked sort that came later. The Marines were the pick of the lot, for size and behavior too. The sense of being something special was with the Marines from the first. They marched that way, and set apart by their olive drab as well as by their size and comportment, they gave the 1st Division's first march in France a quality of real distinction. And when the army got to its first French camps, the welcome sight its eyes first fell upon was that of already arrived Marines carrying water down the hill. The camps were long wooden buildings, rather above the average, as became the status of the visitors, built almost at the top of the hill, looking down over green fields and round trees to the 3 or 4 villages within range of vision, and beyond them to the sea. Some supplies were there already, but the soldiers had had to bring most of their first supper, and the camp cooks had their own troubles getting things just so. Major General Siebert, field commander of the 1st Division, had quarters at camp, so that excuses were not in order. Even for that first supper, the Marines and all others they could commandeer to help them were rushing about preparing things to the very top of their bent. Nobody had town leave for the first day or two, till things were in apple pie order, and the camp was in line to shelter and feed its soldiers for as long as it should be necessary to stay there. If camp life was busy these days, the town life was no less so. The chief hotel, wherein much red plush met the eye from the very entrance, was swarming with officers of both nations and all degrees of rank. General Pershing was there, with his aides and most of his staff. Admirals were there, changing uniforms from blue to white and back again, as the erratic French weather dictated. There were half a dozen high officers from the French army, making both formal and informal welcomes, and there were more busy majors and captains and more interpreters than you could count in half a day's time. The little French woman who sat behind the desk was amiable to the best of her very considerable ability, but the questions she had to answer, whether she understood them or not, would have addled an older head than hers. She could run her hotel with the best of them, but when perfectly sane-looking young officers asked her where to buy 5,000 cups and saucers and paper napkins by the ton, she said in so many words that an American invasion was worse than Bedlam. The hotel's second floor was the favored place for conferences. There a fair welter of red plush was drawn up around a big table in the hallway, and a livid red wall-paper added its warmth to a scene which against a blank wall would not have lacked color. At this table General Pershing could have been found much of the time. The whole practical liaison of French and American armies was contrived here, though the first rule for this consolidation, laid down by a grizzled French general with but one arm left, was that there was no longer anything that was French or anything that was American, but merely all we had that was ours, so that the task was one of detail only. Though the daytimes were packed with work, most of the officers called it a day at sunset. Then the little hotel took on its most engaging color. The little French piano tinkled out in the warm air with an accompaniment of many voices. Once a very blue young second lieutenant chose to express his mood by repetitions without number of the melancholy Warum, probably the first German music that had been heard from that piano for many a moon. Possibly those of the French who knew what the tune was recognized also that America had turned a point in more ways than one in coming to France, not least among them being making good American soldiers out of erstwhile good Germans. Nobody seemed much astonished or put out when within the day a goodly number of American soldiers were speaking to German prisoners in their own language, though talking to the German prisoners, aside from the fact that it was not encouraged by the French, turned out to be indifferent fun, since the American soldiers had had their fill of German propaganda before they left home, and none of the prisoners was over modest as to what Germany was or would do. The cafes out of doors were overflowing with Americans too. It was plenty of fun to hear the sailors scolding the French waitresses for calling lemons limons, and trying to overhaul the French pronunciation of bière to something approaching a compromise. An officer came along and broke up a crap game. The soldiers forgave him, but the civilians did not. It was their first go at the game, and they wanted a lot of teaching. The lone bookstore of the town made the only known effort to get the Americans what they asked for, instead of trying to prevail on them to adopt something French. They sent, perhaps to Paris, to get English books, and they piled their windows high with Macaulay's History of England and Bacon's Essays. The paper-buying habit is ingrown in the American male. He has 3 newspapers under his arm before any afternoon is what it should be, and so the soldiers bought the French papers, 2 and 3 at a time, and carried them around. Any time of day or night, a look out into the town's main street descried a company or 2 of soldiers, on their way from camp for town leave, or on their way back. They marched continually. The motorcycle with the side seat, which was later to be the distinguishing mark of the American army in Paris, made its appearance in the seaport within a day or 2 of the first transport's landing, and eased the burdens of the French motor lorries with which the American supplies had been taken to camp, owing to a delay of the 1st Division's own lorries on a slow ship. And most successful sensation of all, the army mule. The French knew him slightly, because their own army used him on occasion, but no Frenchman could speak to a mule in his own language as these big mule tenders did. It was exalting to watch the army on the march, to see the Marines and the profusion of slim sailors. But the real crowd always gathered around the big Negro stevedores in long navy blue coats, scarlet lined, with brass buttons all the way up the front, over and down the back, likely a thrifty hand-me-down from pre-khaki days, who marched with perfect knowledge of their magnificence. The stevedores, for their part, were as amazed at the French, though on a different score. They accepted with due resignation the fact that the French spoke French. It was when they first saw a Senegalese in French uniform, triple black with tropic suns, but to them a mere one of themselves, and when they hailed him gladly in their English tongue to ask which road to take, that his indecipherable French answer broke them, heart and spirit alike. "Dat one blame stuck-up nigger," said the spokesman, as they trudged their way onward, none the wiser if the Senegalese in his turn had been rebuking them in French for showing off their English. So in its several aspects the 1st Division made its impact upon France, jostled itself a little and the French more, and finally settled down to its short wait at the coast before going inland within sound of the guns to get its training. And because the camps were to be used many times again by other divisions to come on the bridge of ships, the 1st had to be put in some extra licks to make their camp conveniences permanent. They played a few baseball games, and they were encouraged to do a lot of swimming in the off afternoon hours. After a bit, town leave was heavily curtailed, but there was a dispensation now and then for a movie. In the main, they kept their noses to the grindstone. After a little while the men who were to march in Paris on the 4th of July were selected, and preceded by a few sailors with fewer duties and longer indulgences. They entrained on the late afternoon of July 2nd. There was no measuring the disappointment of the ones who were left behind, for the prediction that there would be doings in Paris on the first French 4th of July was to be fulfilled to the letter. But the housekeepers of the army could not be spared for celebration. As soon as the Marines could be dispatched from the seaport, they were sent direct across France to the points behind the lines where their training camps were in waiting, and there within a few weeks the 1st Division reassembled and fell to work. Meanwhile, of the doings in Paris. End of chapter 3.